Hello, I'm Skarakai, and this is going to be a GINX Esports TV Origins episode to remember. Today, we'll be unraveling the mysteries behind arguably the most impactful first-person shooter franchise in video game history. Created by id Software during the mid-90s, following the success of WOLFENSTEIN 3D and Doom, it marked the birth of a new and revolutionary engine, and the arrival of fast-paced and smooth FPS gameplay we now all know and love. That's right. In this episode of Origins, we're talking about the FPS behemoth id Software's Quake, a series that continues to impact the video game industry to this very day. id Software was founded on the 1st of February 1991 by Tim Willits, John Romero, and Adrian and John Carmack. The founders had previously all met in the offices of Softdisk, working on games for a short-lived monthly game subscription product known as Gamer's Edge. It was during his time at Softdisk that programmer John Carmack would make a breakthrough, developing an ingenious way to rapidly side-scroll graphics on the PC that would save on processing times and compensate for the poor graphics on PCs in the early 1990s. Carmack then integrated this technique into his very own engine, known as the Keen engine, named after id Software's first shareware game, Commander Keen. After the release of the Commander Keen series, id Software then offered the Keen engine to prospective buyers, who could then use it to create their own games. The creation and licensing of game engines became something of a trademark for id Software going forward, and with the programming brilliance of Carmack and Romero, id Software was destined for greatness. Within the first year, id Software released Hovertank 3D and Catacomb 3D. Hovertank 3D was a landmark title in first-person game graphics. Although other 3D games of the era may have had more detailed environments, they did not run nearly as smoothly or as quickly as Hovertank 3D, thanks to id Software's new prototype engine. Catacomb 3D came out later that same year, once again first-person, but this time players took control of Petten Everhail, a magician, capable of casting 4 powerful spells: Fireball, Super Fireball, Bolt, and Nuke, against 5 types of enemies: goblins, skeletons, ogres, gargoyles, and dragons. Hovertank 3D and Catacomb 3D were among the first examples of first-person games outside of flight simulators, and acted as testbeds for id Software's new engine, the engine they would use to create WOLFENSTEIN 3D. WOLFENSTEIN 3D was id Software's first mega hit, and it planted the seed for the rise of first-person shooters in the 90s. Set in World War II, players were charged with escaping Castle Wolfenstein, a maze-like prison riddled with guards. WOLFENSTEIN 3D proved to be a commercial success, and a year later, id Software would release another iconic title, Doom. While WOLFENSTEIN 3D had planted the seed for id Software's success, it was Doom where id Software truly reaped the rewards. Although controversial at the time for its satanic imagery and violence, Doom was undoubtedly a pioneer. It introduced the world to deathmatch and co-op networked gameplay.
There you are!
That's pretty cool.
As well as the concept of customizable mods. Doom was unadulterated pure carnage, and included weapons such as the chainsaw, rocket launcher, and the BFG 9000. Doom was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. id Software delivered fans a sequel a year later, Doom 2: Hell on Earth, which was just as, if not more, successful than the original, with the addition of the double-barreled shotgun going down extremely well with the fans. Following the release of Doom 2 in 1994, id Software were untouchable. The back-to-back commercial success of WOLFENSTEIN 3D, Doom, and Doom 2 meant all eyes were on id Software, and the developer had become the market leader after just 3 short years. Expectations were high for their next project, and with the swarm of Doom clones, as they came to be known, now being pumped out by rival developers, it was time to reinvent, time to innovate once again. Shortly after the release of Doom 2, CD-ROM technology arrived.
That's it. The biggest revolution in the recording industry since the invention of the long-playing gramophone record.
The floppy disk era was coming to an end, and the shackles that had limited id Software were now broken. A standard floppy disk at the time held just 1.4 megabytes of data, compared to early CD-ROM discs that could hold over 650 megabytes. The difference was immense, and with 3D graphics becoming increasingly commonplace,
I got a really good feeling for this.
3D accelerators were also growing in popularity. Developers now had more power and more space to work with, and id Software began creating a brand new engine to take advantage of the advancements in technology, and a new game to showcase it. As was now tradition, id Software created a game to debut their new engine, which they called Quake. The name was in fact not new, as id Software had made reference to their upcoming title in a piece of promotional content for their Commander Keen trilogy way before Wolfenstein 3D or Doom. In a note entitled "Coming Soon" from id Software, the developer spoke of an upcoming game called The Fight for Justice, where players would control an individual known as Quake, the strongest, most dangerous person on the continent. Quake was a character straight from id Software's Dungeons & Dragons sessions, inspired by Thor and Norse mythology. According to id Software's note, The Fight for Justice, Quake would start off with a hammer of thunderbolts, a ring of regeneration, and a trans-dimensional artifact. Quake would be able to use his artifact to pass between worlds using slipgates, teleporters that granted him the ability to traverse space and time. We know what you're thinking. This doesn't sound like a first-person shooter at all. And you wouldn't be mistaken. Quake was initially supposed to be a 3D role-playing game in the vein of Catacomb 3D. After prototyping the game in 1992, before the release of Wolfenstein 3D, they found they were unable to replicate their vision for Quake with the technology available, and the idea was put on the back burner. However, after the completion of Doom 2 3 years later, when id Software began working on their new 3D engine, they revisited the idea of the fight for justice, and their protagonist, Quake. Initial plans of creating a fantasy first-person action RPG were scrapped, and id Software instead decided to stick to what they knew best, first-person shooters. The news was well received by fans, and unlike Doom, Quake would be designed for mouse users and would capitalize on advancements in 3D technology. Quake's medley of the somber and dark medieval fantasy RPG setting, with fast-paced and bloodthirsty gunplay, was truly bizarre. The level design was obscure, and was tied together only by the slipgates, the trans-dimensional teleporters id Software had initially envisioned for their action RPG. Quake was a mishmash of ideas that somehow came together beautifully for a unique and unforgettable experience. Sandy Peterson, a big recruit late on in Doom's development, would have a profound impact on Quake's aesthetic and feel, and would later say his contributions to Quake were heavily influenced by the horror fiction novels of H.P. Lovecraft. Creepy. Quake's theme of foreboding horror was evident from its color scheme. At the time, id Software had a modest 256 color palette to work with, but deliberately went with dark greens, browns, and coppers. The result was a dismal and unnerving color scheme, making the game's levels seem even more unwelcoming and slightly terrifying. A huge admirer of id Software's Doom was Trent Reznor, lead singer of the Nine Inch Nails, and the American musician became heavily involved in the Quake project. Reznor assisted in creating sound assets and a soundtrack for Quake completely free of charge, a sinister and hair-raising soundtrack which matched the Quake theme perfectly. And as a tribute to Reznor's contributions in Quake 1, the Nine Inch Nails logo appears on the ammo boxes for the nail gun. It was all coming together for id Software's Quake, and just in time with rival developers beginning to circle. 3D Realms released Duke Nukem 3D in January 1996 to major acclaim, a title that, much like Doom and Wolfenstein 3D, helped popularize first-person shooters. Duke Nukem 3D was proof that id Software's supremacy in the FPS market was under threat. In February 1996, id Software released a demo of Quake on QTest, giving fans a taste of things to come. The full game came with a single-player mode, with 30 levels divided between 4 episodes. Players took control of Ranger, voiced by Nine Inch Nails' Trent Reznor, in his quest to hunt down an enemy codenamed Quake. To reach the game's final boss, players had to collect 4 magic runes from 4 dimensions, with slipgates allowing easy travel between them. The dimensions ranged from lava-filled caves to medieval castles, and a hub was available for players to choose between 4 difficulties: easy, medium, hard, and nightmare, the last only accessible through a secret underwater passage. It was Quake's multiplayer, however, that caught the attention of gamers worldwide. The Quake engine was revolutionary. It offered real-time 3D rendering and early support for 3D acceleration through later patches. It was a technical marvel, but id Software also delivered the goods when it came to the gameplay. And based on the popularity of Doom's deathmatch, id Software knew multiplayer would have to be a big part of Quake. The game shipped with 6 multiplayer maps and made use of advancements in 3D technology to create maps with multiple levels, resulting in far more compelling combat than in Doom. Maps and levels in Quake were more interactive, laden with merciless traps, precarious platforms, and underwater passages. For survival, movement was crucial, and Quake's high-speed gameplay led to truly frantic and exciting engagements. Quake would also be the birthplace of several now trademark gaming techniques, which increased the skill ceiling in Quake and had a lasting impact on first-person shooters. Strafe jumping and bunny hopping, for example, allowed players to increase their maximum speed by mastering a combination of key presses, while rocket jumping enabled players to reach otherwise inaccessible platforms or areas at the cost of some self-damage. Quake's lack of realism at times added to its personality and appeal. Many of Quake's weapons, such as the rocket launcher or grenade launcher, had a delayed explosion, forcing players to predict enemy movement in order to deal damage. This was a new mechanic and incredibly appealing in a multiplayer setting, leading to Quake becoming one of the first games to be considered an esport. To follow Wolfenstein 3D and Doom had been a tall order for id Software, but they smashed expectations, and it wasn't long before work had begun on a sequel.